viewers, I have been discussing Gauri Viswanathan's essay, The Beginnings of English Literary Study in British India. Through this essay, the writer has tried to delineate how, during the colonial period in India, Britishers had tried to use English language and English literature as a tool to impose English culture, English philosophy, and English way of life. In today's video, we will discuss further. In what follows, I propose to outline the preliminary stages of the historical process by which literature was made serviceable to British political interests, a process. So here the writer is saying that the Britishers, they had used through various mediums English literature as a instrument to fulfill their own desires, to fulfill their own goals, and to lay the foundation of British political interests. Then the writer says, a process I may add that is to replete with numerous ironies, contradictions, and anomalies. I have titled my essay, The Beginnings of English, rather than say, The Rise of English or the Growth of English, to emphasize two things. So here the writer is saying that she has titled her essay, The Beginnings of English, rather than The Rise of English or the Growth of English, to emphasize on two things. The first thing is her interest was in seeking out the historical moment at which English literature as a subject for study made its appearance in India. So her first interest in this essay through this literary work is to find out how English literature came into Indian subcontinent. Okay, and a moment that can be identified as a beginning, which in Edward Said's formulation includes everything that develops out of it, no matter how eccentric the development or inconsistent the result. And second, my method of doing so is by describing the historical conditions which enabled that appearance in the first place, indeed even necessitate it. So the writer's second interest is how then historical timeline, then historical circumstance had made Britishers possible to impose English literature, English language in the Indian subcontinent. They used English in education, in administration, and in commerce. And through that, they had imposed English literature and English language. Apart from that, they had also used missionaries in a different way to spread the religious faith of English people through Christianity. Neither of these two goals, I believe, is adequately represented by the words rise or growth, with their implications of inexorable movement along a single path towards the fulfillment of germinal conception or a skeletal structure. Germinal means at a very early stage, nascent stage, okay? Germinal conception or skeletal structure. By this reasoning, The formation of a cultural idea would appear to be a matter of expansion and refinement from a prior, cruder version of it. The description further gives the impression of structural and biological continuity. Though the final form may be as distinct from its originating principle as a living body is from a cell, the differences are blurred by a presumed identity of essence. There is an idea is reduced to itself by virtue of a mode of description that sees it as a developing from its own foundation in a steady linear progression. By confining the search for origins to the tracing of an idea from its own conceptual base, the model of a continuous organic history precludes means to block something, okay, precludes the possibility of foundation existing outside it. Consequently, social, historical, and political events appear merely as context for its development, not as condition for its generation, nor as determinants of its content and shape. To seek beginning is, in many respects, to broaden the range of inquiry in order to include foundations other than those that sustain an idea by essentializing it. In Nietzsche, genealogy and history, Foucault has remarked that what distinguishes genealogical analysis from a mere search for origins is that the former does not neglect as inaccessible the vicissitudes. Vicissitudes means metamorphosis or transformation of history, vicissitudes of history. On the contrary, it will cultivate the details and accidents that accompany every beginning. What follow is an attempt to seek out the myriad historical details, the subtle interplay of event and idea with administrative and political imperatives undergirding the institutionalization and subsequent valorization of English literary study. So, sorry. So, through this passage that I have read, the writer has uh, argued that uh, the Britishers or the British colonial power or the British colonial authorities, they had tried to institutionalize English through various means, for example, administrative and political uh, mediums, and they had tried to valorize English. Valorize, it can be said in various ways. If you talk about Marxism, then in Marxism, valorization means the increase in the value of capital assets through the applications of value forming like labor in production. Okay, so that is valorization, and if you talk in a simple sense, then valorization is nothing but to validate something by government action. Means the Britishers or the colonial authorities, they had used English uh, to convince people that only through English literature, only through English language, the native colonial people, they will be able to excel in science. They will be able to access in life. So that kind of thinking was given by the colonial authority, and uh, they used English as an institution for knowledge, for commerce, and for a better life. And subsequently, the valorization of English literary study, it had impacted, downrightly impacted on native people of India. And they, for the sake of employment, for the sake of uh, enlightenment, they embrace English literary study. And consequently, they thought only English literature is the superior one, and only English language is the uh, splendid language for knowledge, for science, for economics, and for trade, and for everything. That was their perspective due to institutionalization and valorization of English literary study by the colonial authority. Okay, let's move on. English literature made its inroads in India, albeit gradually and imperceptibly, with a crucial event in Indian educational history, the passing of the Charter Act of 1813. This act, which renewed the East India Company's charter for commercial operations in India, produced two major changes in Britain's role with respect to its Indian subjects. One was the assumption of a new responsibility towards native education, and the other was a relaxation of controls over missionary work in India. So, uh, with the passage of time, English literature, uh, it had utterly dominated in Indian subcontinent, and it occurred uh, gradually and imperceptibly, and it was fueled by the passing of the Charter Act of 1813 by the British Parliament, and which had downrightly transformed Indian educational history. And this act, which renewed the East India Company Charter for commercial operations in India, it had produced two major changes in Britain's role with respect to its Indian subjects. Number one was the assumption of a new responsibility towards native education, and the other was a relaxation of control over missionary work in India. So, through the disguise of Charter Act of 1813, the British colonial authority, they use these as an opportunity to display or to prove that they are doing a significant thing by educating the native people of India. Okay. And through this endeavor, they were also able to uh, take control over missionary work in India. These two things they have done under the disguise of Charter Act of 1813. Their main motive was not to uh, thoroughly educate native people of India. Their main motive was to educate uh, Indian native people for the sake of their own gain. They wanted to educate Indian people for their own benefit. Okay, and second is they wanted to uh, have some controls over missionary works that was going on in India at that time. Okay, so their prime goal was to do trade in India. Their main motive was to do commercial operations in India, and that they have done through East India Company. Okay, and without minimizing the historical importance of the renewal of the company charter, it would be safe to say that the more far-reaching significance of the Charter Act lay in the commitment enjoined upon England to undertake the education of the native subjects, a responsibility which it did not officially bear even towards its own people. Hitherto, measures to educate the natives were entirely at the discretion of the Governor General at Calcutta, and the company was in no way obligated to attend to their instruction. Indeed, reluctant as it was to spend any more money on the natives than necessary, the East India Company was all too willing to abide by the practice in England, where education was not a state responsibility. So you must have understood. I will not reiterate it. The Charter Act, however, radically altered the prevailing state of laissez-faire, okay, in Indian educational matters. So the writer is trying to say that through the Charter Act of 1813, the Indian education system, Indian political system, uh, the entire administration was overhauled, and the writer is saying the 13th resolution categorically stated that England was obligated to promote the interests and happiness of the natives, and that measures ought to be adopted as may tend to introduction among them of useful knowledge and of religious and moral improvement. So in the 13th resolution, it was ostensibly categorically stated, explained, described that England was obligated, means in England has a moral responsibility to promote the interest and happiness of the natives. Though they have said like that, but um, in a uh, in other words, they were not doing it, they are just showing it, and that measures ought to be adopted as may tend to introduction among them of useful knowledge and of religious and moral improvement. The pressure to assume a more direct responsibility for the welfare of the natives came from several sources. The earlier and perhaps more significant one, decisively affecting the future course of British administrative rule in India, was the English Parliament. Significantly, the goal of civilizing the natives was far from being the central motivation in these first official efforts at educational activity. Parliamentary involvement with Indian education had a rather uncommon origin in that it began with the excesses of their own countrymen in India. The extravagant and demoralized lifestyles of the East India Company servants, combined with their ruthless exploitation of native material resources, had begun to raise serious and alarming questions in England about the morality of the British presence in India. It was an issue that was too embarrassing for Parliament to ignore without appearing to endorse company excesses, but unable to check the activities of these highly placed nabus. Nabobs, okay? Nabobs means it is a kind of fictional planet that you will get in Star Wars if you have watched, or the writer has said a wealthy Europeans whose huge fortunes were amassed in India. It sought instead to remedy the wrongs committed against the natives by attending to their welfare and improvement. So the writer is saying that the East India Company, it had committed atrocities, it had committed uh, kind of sins on native people. So in order to reciprocate it, the writer is saying some Europeans, they had used uh, British colonial op- rule as an option to go to the native land and to work for the welfare and improvement of the native people. So they are doing it for their guilt, not out of their holy thinking. And the writer is saying that the workers of East Indian Company or the servants of East Indian Company, they were uh, completely, totally ruthless. They exploited the native material, native resources. They embraced corruption for their own benefit. So these all things were seen by the British parliamentary uh, members, and in order to decrease it, in order to uh, obliterate it, the British colonial authority, they uh, took Charter Act 1813 as a tool for the colonial education in native Indian places. Yet, however, much parliamentary discussions of the British presence in India may have been couched in moral terms. There was no obscuring the real issue, which remained political, not moral. The English Parliament's conflict with the East India Company was a long standing one, going back to the early years of trading activity in the East Indies when rival companies clashed repeatedly in a bid to gain exclusive rights to trade in the region. The East India Company formed from two rival companies eventually became the only one group of English merchants entitled to carry on English trade. But the clamor for a broadening of commercial privileges in India never died down, and Parliament found itself uh, besieged by free trade groups lobbying to break the company monopoly. And in 1813, it had no choice but to concede them greater trading privileges. So, the passage itself is explanatory. If you read it, then you will understand it. So I will not reiterate it. Let's move on. Moreover, the English Parliament itself was becoming alarmed by the danger of having a commercial company constituting an independent political power in India. By 1757, the East India Company had already become virtual master of Bengal, and its territorial influence was growing steadily despite numerous financial problems besetting it. But in the absence of any cause for interference in the activities of the company, the British Crown could conceivably do little to reorganize the company's system of administration and win control of its affairs. Pitt's India Bill of 1784 had earlier rejected an outright subordination of the political conduct of the company to the crown, and the government remained ambiguously placed in relation to the company. Not until the last quarter of the 18th century, when reports of immorality and depravity among company servants started pouring in, did Parliament find an excuse to intervene, at which point, in the name of undertaking responsibility for the improvement of the natives, it began to take a serious and active interest in Indian political affairs. It was a move that was to result in gradual erosion of the unchallenged supremacy of the company in India. So the writer is trying to say that how British colonial authority based in London, how they had planned to take the charge of East India Company, and how they used their uh, dominance to gain more strength in India. And with that strength, they imposed English study, English language, English literature, uh, and that had utterly transformed or overhauled Indian education scenario. Okay, one cannot one cannot fail to be struck by the peculiar irony of a history in which England's initial involvement with the education of the natives derived not from a conviction of native immorality, as the later discourse might lead one to believe, but from the depravity of their own administrators and merchants. So the writer is saying, uh, the British colonial authority, they actually, as a matter of fact, they were compelled to educate Indian. Compelled in the sense, uh, they knew if they did not do it, then uh, they would be embarrassed. Therefore, they used Charter Act of 1813 as an opportunity to get uh, to get stronghold in Indian uh, administration or in Indian political scenario, and therefore they use that opportunity uh, as their uh, golden chance to disseminate English language and English literary study. Okay, and it was the immorality of their own people which made them to do so, and not from a conviction of native immorality. And the writer says, in Edmund Burke's words, steps had to be taken to form a strong and solid security for the natives against the wrongs and oppressions of British subjects resident in Bengal. While the protectiveness contained in the remark may seem dangerously close to an attitude of paternalism, you must have heard. If you have not heard, then let me tell you. Paternalism means interference with the liberty on autonomy of another person with the intent of promoting good or preventing harm to that person. For example, uh, they will tell you that please wear helmet, seat belt, or please wear mask for your own cause. If you do not do it, then we will impose fine. So That is an example of paternalism. Okay. Its immediate effect was beneficial as it led to a strengthening of existing native institutions and traditions to act as a bulwark. Bulwark, it means kind of periphery, wall, okay? Wall against the forces of violent change unleashed by the British presence. So, uh, if we talk in a broad context, then the one of the reason behind uh, Britishers uh, imposition of English language and literature in the Indian education system was uh, they had seen fears, they had seen uh, fierce challenge and confrontation from the native people, like they have seen various small and major revolts, uh, mutiny in Indian regions. It also made them feel that if they do not bring education as a tool, then the natives uh, they will be more aggressive, and one day, very soon, uh, Indian colony will no longer be a part of British colony. They will gain freedom. So that fear has also worked, according to the writer. This mission to revitalize Indian culture and learning and protect it from the oblivion to which foreign rule might doom it merged with the then current literary vogue of Orientalism and formed the mainstay of that phase of British rule in India known as the Orientalist phase. So here the writer has talked about Orientalism. You must have heard Orientalism. It is a philosophy, you can say. It is a discourse where it says that how the West portrays the East. Okay, how the West portrays the East. The West, they always try to portray East in their own way. They have believed something about East, they have read something, they have heard something about the East, and they just, without any kind of verification or ground visit, they just try to write it in their own uh, perspective. Okay. And that might be false, that might be stereotypical, but they won't listen to anybody. They just give their own opinion. So that's kind of Orientalism. And from the mainstay of that phase of British, and the writer is saying the British rule on India, that is also kind of Orientalist attitude, because the Britishers, they never tried to comprehend the uh, literary tradition of India. They never tried to understand the psychology of Indian people, the culture of Indian people, the way of life, the lifestyle, the culture, custom. They just imposed their own thinking on them. That is also a part of Orientalism. Orientalism was adopted as an official policy partly out of expediency and caution, and partly out of an emergent political sense that an efficient Indian administration rested on an understanding of Indian culture. It grew out of the concern of Warren Hastings, Governor General from 774 to 785, that British administrators and merchants in India were not sufficiently responsive to Indian languages and Indian traditions. So, as a matter of fact, the Britishers, they never try to understand Indian language, culture, sociological uh, realm, and religion, tradition, everything. They just ignore it, and therefore they could not able to connect with the native population, and it had also detrimental effect on Indian people, and the distance between ruler and ruled was perceived to be so vast as to evoke the sentiment that we rule over them and traffic with them, but they do not understand our character and we do not penetrate theirs. The consequence is that we have no hold on their sympathies, no seat in their affections. Hastings' own administration was distinguished by a tolerance for the native customs and by a cultural empathy unusual for its time. Underlying Orientalism was a uh, tacit policy of what one may call reverse acculturation, whose goal was to train British administrators and civil servants to fit into the culture of the ruled and to assimilate them thoroughly into the native way of life. So here the writer is saying, Orientalism, it was a tacit policy of what we can say it is a reverse acculturation, and its goal was to train British administrators and civil servants to fit into the culture of the ruled and to assimilate them thoroughly into the native way of life. The great scholars produced by 18th century Orientalism includes William Jones, Henry T. Colebrook, Jonathan Halhed, Charles Wilkins, entirely owed their reputation to a happy coincidence of pioneering achievement and official patronage. Their exhaustive research had ambitious goals ranging from the initiation of the West to the vast literary treasures of the East to the reintroduction of the natives to their own cultural heritage, represented by the Orientalists as being buried under the debris of foreign conquest and depredations. So that's it for today. We will meet in the third episode of this lesson, of this series. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for my pronunciation. Since English is not my native language, therefore there will be some pronunciation error. Thank you so much.